upcoming release of the Dwarven Mountain Hold's Arcane Journal, flavour pamphlet, I thought that this was an ideal time to talk about dwarves and their grudges, and in particular one of the most famous of all dwarven grudges, the Grudge of Drong. So anyone who has watched my previous Circle of Blood video will understand I love the old classic Warhammer Fantasy campaign packs from the height of Warhammer 5th edition, but I thought today what I would do is talk a little bit about the history of this campaign, the narrative that runs through it, how the campaign itself worked, and then maybe reflect a little bit on whether it can be applied to the Warhammer the Old World rules. So buckle up and let's dive in. The Grudge of Drong, then. So this is a story that goes way back in Warhammer lore, even before the days of the War of the Beard. This is kind of one of the most notable early battles, I suppose you could say, between the bearded ones and the pointy ears. The story takes place in what is later to be known as Warhammer the Old World, but at that particular time, there isn't really a particular section of the Old World that we can say it's located in. All we can say is it's on the coast and it's somewhere near to what would have been the Dwarven Empire. It centres around three characters: the Dwarven King, Drong the Hard, him of the appropriately named Grudge, his wife, Queen Helga Longplatz, and a High Elf Lord, Lord Eldroth, founder of the Citadel of Tor Eldroth. And the story centres around a story of greed, of ruination, of thrones. It really is almost like a precursor to the kind of the Game of Thrones style conspiracies, with drunkenness and violence and all the other things that make great stories thrown in. The story starts then, as I say, way back before even the War of the Beard, when the Dwarven Empire was at its height. King Gotrek Starbeard was on the throne. The Phoenix King at the time, Caledor II, had yet to cause the tremendous offence that would lead to a centuries-long war and his eventual downfall. And it centres around three settlements, really. There is Khazad Thrund, Crag Bryn, and Tor Eldroth, the trading outpost that was founded by the High Elf Lord Eldroth. These settlements are vital to understanding how this narrative occurred. What happened was this. Way back when the Dwarven Empire was at its strongest, a dwarven adventurer known as Bron the Bold and a gathering of his clansmen ventured forth into some previously unexplored mountain ranges near to the coast, and there they discovered a mountain that was absolutely cram-packed with gold and precious gems and all the things that dwarfs love. So he and his warriors founded a settlement there, which they called Crag Bryn, which literally means gleaming mountain, to represent the sheer amount of treasure that they were able to dig out from beneath the ground in the establishment of their hold. And all the surrounding peaks, to a lesser degree, were also filled with treasure. Bron, though, had a grudge. There was a long-standing grudge between him and an old dwarf lord known as Thrund the Angry. And Thrund, for whatever reason, his clan had this grudge against Bron and their clan. I don't think anyone could actually remember what the origin was without consulting their books of grudges. But Thrund, with a lust for gold, gathered his own warriors and decided to descend upon the Gleaming Mountain to claim it and to claim the throne of Crag Bryn as a settlement of this grudge. A mighty battle took place, therefore, on the sort of low foothills surrounding Crag Bryn, and indeed in the mines beneath. And eventually Thrund was mortally wounded by Bron. But before he died, he made all of his heirs swear that they and their heirs until the 1000th generation would bear this grudge against the line of the Bronlings. And so Khazad Thrund was founded by the surviving Thrundlings on the only pass, the only accessible pass really, out of this mountain range back to the Dwarven Empire. And there, from this mountain keep, the Thrundlings over the centuries exacted taxes from the Bronlings, essentially preventing them from gaining the full benefit of the gold and treasure that they had dug out from beneath the mountain. As I say, hundreds of years passed until eventually the throne of Khazad Thrund is in the hands of his descendant, Drong the Hard. Meanwhile, all of the the male heirs of the Bronling line had died off, leaving only one, a daughter, now to hold the throne, Helga Longplatz, a dwarven queen, it has to be said, who was renowned for the beauty of her long and plaited hair that matched the lustre of any dwarven lord's beard, and her ability to raise a tankard in the mead hall with all the others and quaff just as much beer as the hardest Longbeard. Drong lusted after, not Helga, but for her throne and for the treasure that had long been denied his line, buried beneath the slopes of Crag Bryn. Indeed, whatever his clan had been able to gather in the way of taxes was only the meagrest portion of the treasure he knew was buried beneath Crag Bryn. And so he came up with a scheme, claiming that in actual fact his ancestor was the original heir to the throne of Crag Bryn, not Helga Longplatz. This, of course, was a bald-faced lie, and bald-faced lie, of course, being the worst kind of lie that a dwarf can have. But so great was his lust for gold that he was willing to cast his honour aside to tell this tale. Crag Bryn itself, over the years, had filled with miners who were themselves Thrundlings, who had descended from Crag Thrund to work the mines of the surrounding peaks until, to be honest, the vast majority of the population of the mountains, the miners, the clansmen, were in many respects more loyal to Drong than they were to Helga. Into this hothouse of ambition and lust for gold comes the elves, absolutely determined to put their foot into it. Eldroth, a high elf lord from Lothern, sets sail from Ulthuan to establish a trading outpost on the Old World to bring back riches to Ulthuan in order to strengthen his position at court and secure a greater advancement for his house. He discovered Crag Bryn and quickly realised the advantage that could be posed if an alliance could be struck with the Dwarven Queen. Taking advice from his key warriors, he met with Queen Helga and publicly swore fealty to her. This essentially was a ploy, for in truth there was no way he was going to ever acknowledge that a dwarf was in any way superior to an elf, but nonetheless, by appearing to be her subject and declaring that Tol Eldroth was in essence a protectorate of Crag Bryn, he made it such that Helga was able to call upon his warriors as her sworn shield bearers, and thus, if she needed warriors, the elves would answer. In return, she made bounty of largesse to her new subjects, providing them with gold and treasure from beneath the mountain, which of course enhanced Eldroth's fortunes back in Ulthuan. This did not sit well with the Thrundlings, and in fact with many of the dwarves who lived in Crag Bryn and the surrounding mountains. And into this then comes a troublemaker, known as Crud the Mad Mattock, a dwarven rabble-rouser, a Thrundling by birth, but with good standing among the mining clans. And it was he who roused a drunken, rebellious horde of miners with the intention of marching on Crag Bryn and unseating Helga from her throne, and thus placing his kinsman, Drong, in control, which, of course, would not go well for the elves, because the first thing that Drong would do would be to sever all trade with the elves, and now being in control of both Khazad Thrung, with the control through the mountain pass, and Crag Bryn and its mines, he would be able to pour forth, finally, the treasure of the Gleaming Mountain into the Dwarven Empire, and reap the bounty that it would entail. Helga, realising how tenuous her position was, called upon her kinsmen, her bondsmen, her subjects, the elves of Tol Eldroth, who duly answered and dispatched a small army to block the entrance to Grudge Pass, as the passway through the mountains, through past Khazad Thrund, was known, due to the long-standing nature of the grudge between the Thrundlings and the Bronlings. The elven warrior who was sent forth, a skilled swordsman by the name of Fendar, drew a line in the dust across the width of Grudge Pass with his sword and informed the dwarves that should they cross this line, then bloodshed would be inevitable. It's fair to say that before the dwarves set out, Crud had gotten them absolutely hammered on dwarven ale, and most of them were either propping one another up, throwing up in the bushes, or spoiling for a fight. So it's little surprise that when Crud growled up at Fendar, "Up yours, you pointy-eared scum," the dwarves poured over the line and battle was joined. Despite the best efforts of Fendar to turn back the Dwarven horde, all he was able to do was delay them long enough for their hangovers to kick in. And thus, although the dwarves were stopped from their plan of marching on Crag Bryn, it did little more than inflame the tensions between the elves and the dwarves, as the dwarven miners returned to their mining camps and back to Kazakh Thrund and to Crag Bryn, spreading word of the treacherous nature of these pointy-eared foreigners from over the seas who were interfering in dwarven matters. Helga, realising that things could get much, much worse, called essentially a council with Drong, inviting him and his top advisors to Crag Bryn for a great feast so that they could hopefully finally put matters aside. This, I think, has to have been a desperate gamble by Helga, taking into account the fact that talking a dwarf out of a grudge is nigh on impossible. Nonetheless, the beer flowed, the meat was roasted and succulent, and after, a dozen tankards or so, Drong found himself in the candlelight eyeing Helga and agreeing that she was indeed fair of face, and especially the way in which she could quaff ale till it dripped off her long plaits, in much the same way that his kinsman's beards dripped beer onto the floor. An answer then, it would seem, occurred to Drong that this grudge could be settled without further loss of life and thus further impediment to the strength of his armies. If Helga were to marry him, then the grudge could be settled, for Drong would have his throne, finally, and the wealth that went with it. And Helga's claim upon the throne and the continuation of her line would be assured by the merging of Thrundlings and Bronlings. I can only imagine that Thrund the Angry must have been thrashing in his crypt as this was going on. But nonetheless, a marriage proposal was made and accepted. And the elves breathed a sigh of relief in the hope that perhaps now tensions would lapse and trade could work for the benefit of all parties. Into this comes another troublemaker, a runesmith by the name of Grung. He was an outsider from way, way away in the Dwarven Empire who'd come past Grudge Pass to Crag Bryn seeking counsel with Drong the Hard. Grung had himself lost all of his kinmen to elven raiders. Doubtless, it would seem, Drukari attackers from Nagaroth, but the distinction was not drawn by Grung, who hated elves of all flavour, and by extension hated Helga for treating with them as if they were fellow dwarves. Eldroth could see that if Grung was allowed to stir malcontent, then it didn't matter if the grudge between Helga and Drong was settled. The continuation of Tol Eldroth would be impossible, and so he sent his sneakiest shadow warriors under the command of Tethan, a mage, to ambush Grung whilst he was on the Dwarven high road amongst the high peaks of the mountains. For whatever reason, Grung was up there, perhaps searching for some lost runic weapon or other item that he could use to stoke the fires and anger against the elves. For whatever reason, this ambush was launched, and I'm afraid it did exactly the opposite of what Eldroth had hoped. Grung survived, and although many dwarves were slain by this treacherous dwarven ambush, it did nothing more than stoke the anger against the elves amongst the dwarves. In fact, it broke the marriage between Drung and Helga. Drung throwing things at Helga and accusing her of treachery. Helga, meanwhile, screaming at him that he wanted nothing more than her gold and throne. And so, once more, battle was joined. Helga, knowing that the way to a dwarf's heart is through his stomach, suggested to Eldroth that they imprison Drong's chief brewer, and that he be captured and indeed thrown in his own vat. After the end of the celebration, unfortunately the Dwarven brewer was the only one left behind, having consumed too much of his stock and slipped into a drunken coma. He woke up locked into a thankfully empty beer vat within his own brewery, and Helga issued an ultimatum to Drong in no uncertain terms that he would drop his claim to her throne, or there would be no more beer. After several shaky, sober days for Drong, during which unrest grew amongst his warriors, who knew that unless this matter could be resolved, then the days of gold and ale were gone. Drong sent his sneakiest warrior, Skag the Stealthy, and a dwarven raiding force back to the brewery to chase off the elves who were there and rescue the brewer. Sadly, the direct approach that was taken by Skag, who despite his name, decided a frontal assault was the way to go, was not enough to overcome the massed ranks of elven bowfire. And by the end of the day, although casualties from both sides were heaped high, reinforcements from Tol Eldroth arrived, and the brewer remained imprisoned. After this, there were mass desertions from amongst Drong's ranks, because, I mean, who would fight for a king who couldn't even guarantee a supply of ale? The scene was set then for an attack on Tol Eldroth itself by Drong and his army, with Helga and the remaining warriors of her keep, which numbered no more than a few slayers who were too obsessed with seeking their doom in the name of lost causes to abandon her, stood on the sidelines trying to decide would she aid her fellow dwarves or stand by the elves that she had dragged into this conflict. On the plains before Tol Eldroth and Crag Bryn then, battle was joined, a massed horde of dwarves, outnumbered even by the forces of the elves, with reinforcements having sailed from Ulthwan, including heroes from Tiranoc. Ardath, the commander of the defence of the brewery, stood to one side of Eldroth, a champion of Tiranoc on the other. As battle was joined, Eldroth sought out single combat with Drong the Hard, but this was to be his undoing, as with a single blow of his mighty runic warhammer, Eldroth was slain. Enraged at the death of his kinsman, Ardath attacked Drong with great fury, the dwarven hammerers of his bodyguard throwing themselves in the path of the vengeful elven lord's sword. Seeing her kinsman being slain in this way, Helga finally recanted her ways and drove her band of dwarven slayers into the battle to try and save Drong, recanting her friendship with the elves, but too late. Ardath cut down Drong, and with the death of their king, the dwarven forces retreated. Enraged at the betrayal by Helga, Ardath then turned his forces against the warriors from Crag Bryn, and Helga and the few remaining slayers had to retreat back into their citadel and seal it up. Crud, as the most senior surviving member of Drong's kinsmen, assumed the throne of Khazad Thrung and agreed to forgive Helga her sins if she also ceded the throne of Crag Bryn. Before any matter could be resolved, though, a greater conflict engulfed all of them as the War of the Beard finally broke out, and massed dwarven reinforcements from the Empire came down through Grudge Pass to drive the elves from the shores of the Old World. In this way, in many respects, I suppose the Grudge of Drong is like almost the first battle of the War of the Beard, even though it's not motivated by the shearing of the dwarven ambassador that was to come. It's a great campaign pack, and it came with some brilliant kind of cardboard scenery that mostly was used just to make the Dwarven Brewery and its associated buildings. I've got that scenery and I'm going to be building it in a future video, so if you enjoy any videos of me sticking myself to cardboard and crying, by all means tune in for that. But let's talk a little bit about how the campaign works. So it was 4 linked games, essentially made up of different sized forces, each led by a particular character. So the first one, of course, the battle between the drunken miners and Finbar. The scenario there essentially is the board is divided in half with a line, imaginary line drawn down the middle of the board, and it's only when the dwarves cross that centre line or open fire upon the elves that battle is joined. There is a chart that you can roll on to see what drunken actions the dwarves take, whether they, angrily swerve towards the enemy with additional movement or take a turn out from moving to be sick. It's great fun, and the impact of that game is if you are successful in that initial kind of battle, if the dwarves win the first battle, then it means that they get more war machines in the final battle because they've got access to all the ore and so forth that can be mined by Crud and his warriors. If, on the other hand, the elves are successful, if they can kill Crud or defeat the rebellion, then the dwarves are limited to only a small number of war machines in the final battle, which, of course, given that how much dwarven war machines can make a difference, is a big difference. Likewise, the second battle is all about Grung, the dwarven runesmith being ambushed by a force of elves that's pretty much just composed of like bowmen and swordmasters and shadow warriors and great eagles and an elven mage. And it's all about whether or not the dwarves can make it down a road that edges onto essentially a cliff edge, or whether they will be driven off the cliff edge by the elven ambush. If the dwarves are successful, if they can keep the runesmith alive and get him off the board, or can keep him alive and keep most of their force alive till the end of the game, then they get plenty of runic weapons in the final battle. Whereas, if the runesmith is slain, or if the dwarven warriors are driven off the cliff, then the dwarves are limited to only the runic heirlooms that Drong has in his citadel for the final battle. So again, it limits the access to magic items that the dwarves have. The third battle is essentially just all about, can the dwarves get the brewer out of his vat and rescue him? The elves set up essentially defending a fortified position, defending the brewery. The dwarves have to attack, but because Skag is supposed to be stealthy, one of his units can essentially come in from the flanks later in the game and try and sneak round behind the elves. All they have to do is get a warrior in base-to-base contact with the brewery to free the brewer. So you would think it's not that tricky a scenario, but I suppose it's down to how cannily the elves defend that brewery as to whether or not the dwarves are successful. If the dwarves fail in their mission, then they end up with 500 points less warriors than the elves in the final battle. So the final battle is supposed to be 3,000 points aside, but if the dwarves fail to rescue the brewer, then it's 2,500 for the dwarves, 3,000 for the elves. And crucially, the dwarves are limited in terms of like a flame cannon or a gyrocopter that they can bring, because the alcohol from the beer and from the brewery is needed for the volatile fuel for the gyrocopter or for the fuel for the flame cannon. The final battle is just a straight up throwdown fight, and what is cool is if a player wins one of the earlier scenarios, then the special character that they had for that scenario is available to be used in the final mission. If, on the other hand, that character is killed or the game is lost, then that character is not available for the final mission. So in the real playthrough that Games Workshop did when they wrote the rules and the background for the Grudge of Drong, the only elven character who was available was Ardath, because he successfully defended the dwarven brewery. But likewise, the only dwarven character who wasn't available in the final scenario was Skag the Stealthy, because he'd failed in his mission, and so had to go and shave his beard and join the dwarven slayers in the ranks of Helga's army. How could this work for Warhammer the Old World? Well, I've taken a look at the army lists, and to be honest, mostly I think they would work fairly well with the Old World rules. I mean, in terms of there isn't really a core, a special, a rare option in 5th edition Warhammer, because that just wasn't a thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those options couldn't be rolled in to drawing up the battle scrolls for what each army can take. I mean, in terms of units, I just tried as an example of drafting up an army based upon the forces available to Crud Mad Mattock in that first scenario. And it's eminently possible to build a 1,500 point force using all of those options. And in fact, it's eminently possible to make a character who's almost identical to Crud Mad Mattock simply by giving a Thane a great weapon with the Master Rune of Swiftness on it, which is what Crud wielded. And in actual fact, his stat line is almost identical to a Dwarven warrior at that time. So it is definitely possible. I have plans, once I've got my Grudge of Drong scenery painted and got a few more dwarves painted up, to play through all 4 scenarios for the Grudge of Drong. I'd like to play them through using the Warhammer Fantasy 5th edition rules as they were originally written for. But if that goes well, then if people are interested, I'd be intrigued to try and play them through using the Warhammer the Old World rules and see how well they play differently. If there is an interest for that, then please let me know in the comments, and what I will do is I will draft up a rules pack for using Grudge of Drong in Warhammer the Old World, and I'll make that available over on my Patreon. Wow, okay, that's a lot of stuff about dwarves. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's filled you with grudgy energy in advance of the Dwarven release in a week's time. If you have enjoyed this video, please think about subscribing. Please let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget to catch me on the Warhammer podcast every week as well. There's a link for that in the description to this video. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. And as ever, I shall catch you next time. Bye for now.